The man in my living room called himself a caregiver. He made my tea every morning, helped me with my groceries, and smiled like someone who genuinely cared. What I didn't know, what my daughter made sure I wouldn't know, was that he had been watching me for months before he ever knocked on my door. The coffee had been sitting on the counter long enough to go cold, but I hadn't touched it yet. That was the kind of morning it was. The kind where you move through your own kitchen like a visitor, opening cabinets out of habit, setting things down without purpose, filling the silence with small tasks that don't need doing. My name is Margaret Calloway. I'm 74 years old, a retired nurse, a widow of 3 years, and the owner of a pale yellow house on the quieter end of Magnolia Street in Charleston, South Carolina. I had spent the better part of my adult life taking care of other people, patients, family, neighbors, anyone who needed it. I was good at it. What I was less good at, it turned out, was accepting that someone might need to take care of me. That was the conversation my daughter had been trying to have with me for the better part of 6 months. The phone rang at 8:20. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Mom. Stephanie's voice carried that particular brightness she used when she had already decided something and was calling to present it as a suggestion. She was 46 years old, sharp, quick-moving, the kind of woman who kept 3 calendars and still managed to be late to things that mattered. I loved her the way you love someone you've known longer than anyone else in the world, completely, and with a full understanding of their flaws. You sound like you have news, I said. I found someone, she said, a caregiver. He's wonderful, Mom. His references are spotless. He's been doing this for years. He's professional, he's kind, and he's available starting this week. I leaned against the counter. I told you I didn't need. I know what you told me. Her tone didn't shift, not even slightly. I'm asking you to try. 2 weeks, that's all. Just let him come by, help out around the house, be there in case you need anything. If you hate it, we stop. I looked out the kitchen window at the garden Walter had planted the spring before he passed. The roses needed tending. The back fence had a board that had been loose for 2 months. There were boxes in the hall closet I hadn't been able to bring myself to open. 2 weeks, I said. 2 weeks, she confirmed. His name is Tyler. He'll be there at 10. He arrived at 9:53. I heard the car in the driveway before the knock, a clean, unhurried sound, like someone who had practiced being unobtrusive. When I opened the front door, the man standing on my porch looked exactly like what you'd hope for. Tall, perhaps 35, with dark hair neatly kept, and the kind of calm, open expression that people in caregiving tend to develop or learn to perform. He was holding a folder in one hand and smiling in a way that reached his eyes just enough to seem genuine. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I'm Tyler. It's really good to meet you. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. His shoes were clean. His voice was warm without being familiar, the right amount of everything, calibrated just precisely enough that I noticed the calibration. We sat in the living room while he walked me through his background. 7 years of private caregiving, CPR certified, first aid trained. A list of previous clients, all elderly, all with letters of recommendation printed on clean paper in a clear plastic sleeve. He answered my questions directly, never stumbling, never overselling. He knew when to pause and when to speak. He asked about my routine, my preferences, whether I had any mobility concerns or medical appointments coming up. Everything he said was correct. Everything he did was appropriate. And yet, it was the kind of feeling I used to get sometimes during long overnight shifts at the hospital, a quiet alertness that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with something underneath the facts. A sense that the room wasn't quite what it appeared to be. I had learned over decades of nursing not to dismiss that feeling. I had also learned not to act on it without evidence. So I smiled. I offered him coffee, which he declined politely. I told him the schedule Stephanie and I had discussed: mornings 4 days a week, light housekeeping, occasional errands, company when I wanted it and space when I didn't. He nodded. He wrote things down. He asked about the garden. Before he left, he crouched down to greet my dog, a 9-year-old beagle who had been watching him from the corner of the room since he arrived. Biscuit hadn't moved, hadn't barked, just sat there with the steady, measuring attention that old dogs have when they're still deciding. Hey there, Tyler said, reaching out his hand for Biscuit to sniff. It's okay, Biscuit. You can check me out. I felt the air in the room change before I understood why. I hadn't said my dog's name. Not once during the entire conversation. There had been no introduction, No moment where I'd called him over or referred to him by name. The folder Tyler held hadn't been opened in front of me. Stephanie hadn't mentioned the dog when she called. Tyler scratched Biscuit behind the ear, straightened up, and smiled at me again. "See you Thursday, Mrs. Calloway." He walked to his car. He drove away. The street returned to its usual quiet. I stood at the window for a long moment, watching the empty driveway, turning that single detail over in my mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. He knew my dog's name. I had not told him. And as I finally picked up my cold coffee and took a slow sip, one question settled into the back of my mind like something that had been waiting for the right moment to arrive. Where exactly had Tyler gotten that name? Thursday arrived the way Tyler did, quietly, without much warning. He came through the front door at 10 o'clock sharp, set his jacket over the back of the entryway chair, and moved into the living room with the ease of someone already making himself at home. I was standing near the hallway when it happened. He pulled out the armchair by the window, Walter's chair, the one with the worn armrest on the right side where my husband used to rest his elbow, while he read and sat down in it without hesitation, without knowing, without any reason to know. He opened his folder and started reviewing his notes for the day, and I stopped moving entirely. It wasn't the chair itself. Furniture is furniture. I knew that. I had told myself that many times over the past 3 years. But something about watching another man settle into that particular seat, in that particular way, with that particular ease, it pulled me backward before I could stop it. Walter Calloway had been 69 years old when his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in October. He had been making breakfast. I found him on the kitchen floor beside the stove, the eggs still on the burner, the radio still playing the morning news program he listened to every day without fail for 31 years. He was a quiet man, steady and unhurried, the kind of person who fixed things around the house on Saturday mornings and never mentioned it, who remembered the names of every neighbor on our street and asked about their families with genuine interest. We had been married for 44 years. I had spent more of my life with him than without him, and when he was gone, I discovered that grief isn't one feeling. It's the absence of a structure you didn't know you were leaning on. The first months were the hardest to navigate practically. There were accounts to transfer, legal documents to sort through, insurance matters that required phone calls I wasn't prepared to make. I handled all of it. I had been a nurse for 32 years. I knew how to function in a crisis, how to move through tasks, even when everything inside you wanted to stop. So I functioned. I made the calls. I signed the papers. I cleared the hospital equipment from the bedroom and returned it without letting myself think too hard about what I was doing. Stephanie was there in the beginning. She drove down from Columbia twice in the first month, brought food, sat with me in the evenings, helped me sort through the practical things. She was attentive in the way adult children are when the loss is still fresh and the guilt of living far away is still sharp. I was grateful for it. I didn't need much, just the presence of someone who had also loved him, someone who understood the specific shape of the absence. But grief has a way of outlasting other people's attention. By the 3rd month, the calls grew shorter. By the 5th, they came less frequently. By the end of the 1st year, we had settled into a rhythm that was cordial and distant, in equal measure, birthdays acknowledged, holidays navigated, the kind of relationship that functions perfectly well on the surface and says very little underneath. I didn't blame her for it. She had her own life, her own pressures, her own version of loss to carry. But I noticed the distance. You always notice. You just learn to stop mentioning it. What I found, in the space that opened up after Walter and after Stephanie's attention faded, was something I hadn't expected. Capability. Not the forced, mechanical capability of those first months, but something quieter and more genuine, the slow discovery that I was more self-sufficient than I had ever been required to be. I managed the house, I maintained the finances, I tended the garden Walter had planted and kept the fence in reasonable repair and drove myself to every appointment without asking anyone for help. Not because I was trying to prove something, but because it turned out I simply could. I had spent so much of my life caring for others that I had never fully tested what I was capable of when the only person I needed to take care of was myself. That knowledge was hard-won. I wasn't willing to give it up easily, which was part of why Stephanie's announcement about Tyler had unsettled me in a way that went beyond the practical. It wasn't just a caregiver showing up at my door. It was someone being placed in my home by my daughter in a role that implied I needed placing. And underneath the reasonable arguments I was 74, I lived alone, the world could be unpredictable, was the quiet suggestion that the independence I had built piece by piece over 3 years might not be entirely mine to keep. The hiss of the kettle brought me back. Tyler had moved to the kitchen table. He had made himself coffee, I had told him to help himself, and was sitting in Walter's usual spot at the table, reviewing something on his phone. He looked up when I walked in, offered an easy smile, and gestured toward the counter. "I made enough for 2 if you want some." "Thank you," I said. I sat across from him and wrapped my hands around a fresh mug. The kitchen felt the same as it always did. Same yellow walls, same morning light through the window above the sink, same slight creak in the 3rd floorboard near the refrigerator. Everything in its place, everything familiar. I reached for the small stack of mail I hadn't gotten to, yet the kind of ordinary task that fills ordinary mornings. 3 envelopes. 2 were the usual, a utility notice and a circular I wouldn't read. The 3rd was from my bank. Monthly statement. I opened it the way I always did, automatically, already knowing roughly what I expected to see. The number at the bottom of the page was not the number I expected. I read it again, then a 3rd time. The difference wasn't enormous, but it was there, a gap between what I remembered and what the statement showed, sitting on the page in plain, indifferent print. I set the paper down slowly, keeping my expression exactly where it was. Across the table, Tyler lifted his mug and took a calm, unhurried sip. 2 weeks in, I still hadn't found an explanation for that number. I had gone back to the statement 3 times, once the morning after, once 2 days later, and again the following week when a quieter part of my mind kept returning to it, the way your tongue finds a sore tooth. Each time, the gap was the same. Not enormous, not the kind of discrepancy that would send most people rushing to the phone. But I had managed my own finances for 32 years of marriage and 3 years on my own, and I knew the rhythm of my accounts the way I knew the creak of my own floorboards. Something was off. The reasonable explanations? I had tested them all. An automatic withdrawal I had forgotten about, a fee I hadn't noticed, a timing difference between when a payment posted and when I remembered making it. None of them fit precisely. And yet none of the alternatives fit either, not without requiring me to believe something I wasn't ready to believe, about a man who had been in my home for exactly 14 days. So I did what practical people do when the evidence is thin and the cost of being wrong is high. I filed it away. I told myself it was probably nothing. I decided to watch. That part, at least, turned out to be easy, because Tyler gave me plenty to watch. He had settled into the rhythm of my household with a smoothness that should have been reassuring. He arrived on time every time. He kept the kitchen clean without being asked. He fixed the loose board on the back fence on his 2nd Tuesday, presenting it as an afterthought. I noticed it when I was out back. "I hope that's okay," and spent 20 minutes on it before I had the chance to say I'd been meaning to get to it myself. Small things, useful things, the kind of considerate gestures that accumulate into a portrait of a person you can trust. The first time he made me breakfast without asking, I noticed but said nothing. It was oatmeal with sliced peaches and a small pour of cream, exactly the way I liked it, which I had never mentioned, not once. I thought perhaps Stephanie had told him. Later, I realized she hadn't known that particular detail herself, not since we'd lived under the same roof 20-some years ago. He remembered my physical therapy appointment on Wednesday before I mentioned it. He knew I preferred the radio off in the afternoons. He bought the specific brand of hand soap I used without being told what it was, just returned from an errand one day, and placed it under the sink, quiet as a delivered verdict. Each of these things, taken alone, could be explained. Together, they created a low-level hum of unease I couldn't quite locate, like a sound just below hearing, present but not provable. The question started in the 3rd week, sliding into ordinary conversation with the ease of someone who had practiced blending them in. "Do you have a regular person who handles the yard work in the fall?" he asked one afternoon, pulling weeds along the garden border while I sat on the porch. "I just want to make sure we're thinking ahead for you." A few days later, over lunch, Stephanie mentioned you've had this house a long time. Have you thought about whether you want to stay here long term, or whether something smaller might be easier to manage eventually? And then, on a Thursday afternoon while helping me organize the hall closet, I always ask the families I work with, do you have your important papers somewhere easy to find? Insurance documents, that kind of thing? You'd be surprised how often people have everything scattered, and when something comes up, nobody can locate what they need. Each question was wrapped in care. Each one had a reasonable explanation. A good caregiver thinks ahead, anticipates needs, helps families prepare. I had been a nurse. I knew what attentive professional support looked like. I also knew what it looked like when someone was gathering information under the cover of concern. The trouble was, both things looked exactly the same from the outside. I answered carefully. I kept my responses general. Yes, I had insurance. Yes, things were organized. Yes, I had thought about the future. I gave him shapes without details, outlines without contents. And I watched his face while I did it, looking for the thing underneath the pleasant expression, the flicker that would tell me whether my instincts were right or whether I was doing a disservice to a man who was simply doing his job. I didn't find it. He was very good. On Friday, at the end of his shift, he paused in the doorway of the living room. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I hope this doesn't overstep, but I've been thinking you have a lot of important paperwork in different places. Insurance policies, financial documents, property records. It might give you real peace of mind to have everything organized in one place, easy to find and easy to reference. I do this for a lot of my clients. It doesn't take long, and it means you always know exactly where things stand." He smiled. "I just want to make sure you're protected." The word landed quietly. Protected. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the Ho-A-Dun I had checked 3 times. I thought about the oatmeal I hadn't ordered and the hand soap I hadn't mentioned and the fence board fixed without asking. "All right," I said. "That would be helpful." He nodded, said goodnight, and left. I locked the door, stood in the hallway for a moment, and breathed. I had agreed because refusing would have told him something, and I wasn't ready for him to know what I was thinking. Not yet. I went to bed at 10. By 11 I was still awake, staring at the ceiling, cataloging small unanswerables. Sometime close to midnight, I heard a soft, careful sound from the direction of Walter's study down the hall. Not loud, not urgent. The kind of sound that could be a house settling or a branch against a window, except that there was no wind that night, and I knew every sound this house made in the dark. I lay perfectly still. The sound came once more, and then stopped. I had told myself the sound was nothing. In the light of the following morning, standing in the kitchen with fresh coffee and reasonable logic that had been easy enough to believe, old houses settle, pipes shift, a branch scrapes a window and the dark turns it into something it isn't. I had repeated these explanations to myself at intervals over the following days until they became comfortable, the way any story becomes comfortable when you tell it often enough. But a month in, the small things had accumulated to the point where comfort required more effort than I had. It started with the drawer. Walter's study had been largely undisturbed since he passed. I used it occasionally for my own paperwork, but I had kept it close to the way he'd left it, partly out of habit and partly out of something I didn't examine too closely. The bottom left drawer of the desk was where I kept older documents, property records, insurance policies going back several years, the kind of paperwork that rarely needed accessing but needed to exist somewhere findable. I knew exactly how that drawer sat when closed. Walter had always pushed it in slightly crooked, a quirk of the old wood, and I had never corrected it because it had become as familiar as anything else in the room. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked into the study for a pen and noticed the drawer was flush, perfectly even, pushed in straight. I stood there for a moment. Then I opened it. Everything appeared to be in order. The folders were upright, the documents inside them visible through their labeled tabs. Nothing was missing that I could identify immediately. But the arrangement was slightly different from what I remembered the insurance folder in front rather than behind the property documents, a small deviation that most people would never notice, and that I could not say with certainty hadn't always been that way. I closed the drawer and stood very still for a moment. Then I went back to the kitchen and said nothing. Over the following 2 weeks, I began paying attention in a different way, not the passive wariness I had been carrying since the first morning, but something more deliberate. I started noticing the things I had been explaining away. The way certain papers on my desk were never quite where I had left them, close but not precise, like a photograph replaced a quarter inch from its original position. The way Tyler occasionally excused himself to make calls in the back hallway, his voice dropping to a register too low to carry, his body turned slightly away from any open doorway. I noticed that he spent more time in Walter's study than his duties required. Light housekeeping didn't demand much from a room that was rarely used, and yet, Stephanie called on a Wednesday afternoon, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the direction of the conversation. "Have you thought any more about the property?" she asked, after we had moved through the standard exchange of how are yous and how's the weather. "What property?" I said. "The house, Mom. Just long term. Whether you want to stay there, whether it makes more sense eventually to think about something smaller, maybe a community with more support around you." She paused. "Tyler mentioned you two had talked about it a little." I kept my voice even. "We touched on it briefly. He said you seemed open to the idea." I had not seemed open to the idea. I had given Tyler a general answer to a general question because I hadn't wanted to show my hand. I had not expressed openness. I had expressed nothing. "I'm still thinking," I said. Stephanie moved on. We talked about other things. But after I set the phone down, I sat at the kitchen table and turned the conversation over carefully. Tyler had reported back to her. Not just the fact of the conversation, but his interpretation of it, a version that leaned toward exactly the conclusion he had been angling for. They were comparing notes. The following Friday, I was in the garden when I heard Tyler's voice through the open window of the back hallway. He was on his phone. I had come in from outside to get my gardening gloves from the hook near the door, and I stopped when I heard the tone quieter than his usual register, more clipped, the voice of someone giving a report rather than having a conversation. I didn't move. "Not going to be an issue," he was saying. "She's cooperative, hasn't pushed back on anything." A pause. "I know. I'm working on the timeline." Another pause, slightly longer. "Stephanie, I told you these things take time if you want them to hold up." "Stephanie." I pressed myself against the wall beside the door and kept breathing. "The documentation side is mostly handled," he continued, his voice dropping further. "Give me another 2 weeks. 3 at the outside." I heard him shift, the soft sound of shoes on the hallway floor, and I moved back outside before he could reach the doorway. I was crouching over the garden bed, gloves on, when he appeared at the back door a moment later. "Everything okay out here?" he asked pleasantly. "Fine," I said without looking up, "just getting ahead of the weeds." He went back inside. I stayed in the garden for another 20 minutes, pulling at things that didn't need pulling, keeping my hands busy while my mind worked in silence. The timeline, the documentation, give me 2 more weeks. Words that fit together into a shape I couldn't fully see yet, but that I felt with the particular clarity of someone who had spent decades reading situations from incomplete information. Something was being arranged, something that involved my home, my daughter, and a man I had let inside my house because I had been persuaded it was the kind thing to do. I didn't know enough yet to know what it was, and that, more than anything else, was the part I couldn't sit still with. The last of the morning light had barely reached the kitchen window when my phone buzzed against the counter. I didn't recognize the number at first, just a local area code and a prefix I associated with the medical district. I set down my coffee and picked it up. "Mrs. Calloway?" The voice on the other end was calm, professionally measured. "This is Dr. Ellison, from Coastal Family Practice." I knew Dr. Ellison. I'd been his patient for 11 years. He'd treated my sciatica, monitored my blood pressure, signed off on my annual wellness forms without much fuss. He was a practical man, not one for unnecessary calls. That alone told me something. "Good morning, doctor," I said, keeping my voice even. "I wanted to reach out personally," he began, and the careful way he chose that word personally made me set my mug down on the counter without thinking. "I received a request last week, a formal written request, asking that I conduct a cognitive capacity evaluation for you." I stood very still. "The request," he continued, "came from your daughter, Stephanie Calloway." A brief pause. It was accompanied by a written account of incidents, moments of confusion, she said. Difficulty managing finances, episodes of forgetfulness. Another pause. "I want to be transparent with you, Margaret. That report has already been filed. With the court, the kitchen felt smaller. Based on that documentation," Dr. Ellison said, "a guardianship hearing has been placed on the docket." I heard myself ask, very quietly, "How long?" 3 weeks, he said. "Margaret, I want you to know my office did not initiate this. I received the request and I'm informing you directly, as your physician. You have rights here. I'd strongly encourage you to speak to an attorney." I thanked him. I said I would. I pressed the red button on the screen to end the call, and I placed the phone face down on the counter. For a long moment, I just stood there, one hand on the cool tile edge, listening to the house. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed slowly on the street outside. Biscuit, my old beagle, was somewhere in the back room. I could hear his nails on the hardwood as he shifted in his sleep. 3 weeks. Stephanie had told the court I was confused, that I struggled with money, that I was forgetting things. She had put together a file, a written account, Dr. Ellison had said, of incidents, and submitted it without ever once sitting down at my kitchen table and asking me how I was doing. I thought of the phone call 2 weeks ago when she'd asked about my long-term plans. The way she'd phrased it, casual and breezy, like we were just chatting. I told her I didn't have any particular plans, that I was fine. Fine. I wondered what she'd written down after that. I thought of Tyler and all the quiet, patient weeks of him. The way he'd moved through this house like he already knew its rhythms. The questions he'd asked about the yard, about the insurance paperwork, about whether my important documents were easy to find. The night I'd heard something in Walter's study and told myself it was the house settling. The drawer that had moved. I had told myself I was being paranoid. I had talked myself down, the way practical women do when the alternative is too unpleasant to sit with. But Dr. Ellison's voice had been careful in a way that didn't leave room for self-talk. A guardianship hearing. On the docket. 3 weeks. I pressed my fingertips to my lips and stared at the window above the sink. The light outside was ordinary yellow and September soft, falling across the garden Walter had planted. The roses he'd put in the ground 20 years ago were still blooming, stubborn and bright, the way some things are. He would have known exactly what to do. He would have made a list, called a person, gotten very quiet and very focused in the way he did when something needed handling. Walter was not a man who panicked. He was a man who prepared. I wondered if he'd anticipated something like this. I wondered if that was part of why he'd left things organized the way he had. But I didn't have time to wonder for long. Everything okay? I turned. Tyler was standing in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, shoulder leaning lightly against the frame. He was dressed for the day, neat shirt, dark slacks, and holding a small notepad he used to write down grocery reminders. His expression was open, easy, the way it always was. He was smiling. Not a big smile, just the comfortable, settled smile of a man who belongs somewhere, a man at home. "You looked a little tense," he said, nodding toward the phone on the counter. "Everything okay?" I looked at him for one long moment. Behind that smile was a stillness I hadn't noticed before, or maybe hadn't let myself notice. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answers. "Fine," I said. The same word I'd used with Stephanie. Tyler nodded, easy as anything, and glanced down at his notepad. "I was thinking of making chicken soup for lunch. I noticed you had the stock in the cabinet. Sound good?" "That sounds fine," I said. He pushed off from the doorframe and disappeared back down the hallway, soft footsteps fading toward the kitchen pantry. I picked up my phone from the counter. 3 weeks. And the man who had been living in my house for 6 weeks was standing in my kitchen, smiling and waiting. The call came at 6:30. Tyler stood in the kitchen doorway, jacket already on, keys in hand, and told me his cousin had been in a minor accident. Nothing serious, he said, just a fender bender on the interstate, but family was family. He'd be back by 10, maybe 10:30. I told him to drive safe. I listened to his car back out of the driveway. I listened to the sound of it fade down the street, turning left at the corner the way he always did. And then I stood in my own hallway and listened to something I hadn't heard in 6 weeks. Silence. Not the careful, managed quiet of a house that has another person in it, the kind where you unconsciously track footsteps, water running, a door closing down the hall. This was different. This was the house the way it used to be, when it was mine. I stood there for a full minute, maybe longer. Then I walked to Tyler's room. I want to be clear about something. I am not a woman who goes through other people's things. In 44 years of marriage, I never once opened Walter's desk without asking. I raised Stephanie to understand that privacy was a form of respect. I have always believed that. But I thought about Dr. Ellison's voice on the phone that morning, careful. The way his words had been careful, and I thought about the drawer that had moved, and the papers that had shifted, and the word timeline drifting out of the hallway. And I opened Tyler's door. The room smelled like his cologne, something cedar-edged and clean. He'd made the bed with military precision, corners tucked flat. The nightstand held a glass of water, a charging cable, a paperback with a bookmark near the end. Everything orderly. Everything the picture of a responsible, considerate houseguest. I went straight to the desk. The top drawer held ordinary things: pens, a small notepad, a phone charger still in its packaging. The second drawer held a folder, manila, thick, my name written on the tab in black ink, not Tyler's handwriting. Neater, formal. I opened it. The first page was a document on legal paper, single-spaced, with a notary seal embossed at the bottom right corner. I had to read the header twice before the words arranged themselves into something I could understand. Last will and testament of Margaret Ann Calloway. My name, my address, my date of birth, rendered correctly in the second line. I turned the page. The language was standard. I recognized the structure from when Walter and I had drafted our own wills years ago, sitting across from a lawyer downtown on a Tuesday afternoon while Stephanie played with a paperclip in the waiting room. Boilerplate sentences, the kind that say, I hereby and in the event of and all assets thereto. But the content was not ours. Everything, the house on Palmetto Drive, Walter's pension accounts, the small investment portfolio we'd built over 30 years, the savings bonds I'd kept in the fireproof box in the closet, all of it directed to Stephanie Lynn Calloway, sole beneficiary. No conditions, no exceptions. No mention of Sophie. I turned to the signature page. My signature was there, or something that looked like it. The same careful loops I'd used since high school, the small upward curl on the M. I stared at it for a long time, trying to find the thing that was wrong about it, the way you stare at a word you've spelled correctly 1,000 times until suddenly it looks foreign. The notary seal was dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, I had been sitting in this same house, watching Tyler make oatmeal and answer emails, and someone had signed my name to a document that erased my granddaughter from everything I owned. Behind the will was a second section. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. At first it read like a calendar, dates down the left margin, brief notes to the right. Monday, physical therapy, 10 a.m. Tuesday, groceries, prefers Piggly Wiggly on Meeting Street. Wednesday, calls Stephanie, usually after 7 p.m. My routines, my schedule. Every predictable movement of my ordinary life, cataloged over weeks. Behind that was a printed list. Property addresses. Account types, not numbers, but descriptions close enough. Joint savings, First National. IRA, Walter Calloway deceased, transferred 2021. Home equity, paid. Someone had done their homework. I turned to the last page. It was a photograph, printed on regular paper, slightly pixelated the way phone pictures look when you enlarge them. Sophie, my granddaughter, 9 years old, gap-toothed smile, the picture taken at Easter. I realized because she was wearing the yellow dress Stephanie had bought her. I recognized the corner of my own backyard in the background. Across her face, drawn in red marker, was an X. I don't know how long I stood there. Then I heard it. A sound from the front of the house, small, metallic, unmistakable. The scrape of a key finding a lock. I closed the folder, placed it back in the drawer the way I'd found it, as close to exact as my hands would let me. I pushed the drawer shut. I stepped out of the room, pulled the door to the same degree it had been open, and walked down the hall toward my own bedroom, quiet, deliberate, each step measured against the sound of the deadbolt turning. The front door opened just as I reached my doorway. Back early, Tyler called from the entrance. Turns out it wasn't as bad as they thought. That's good news, I said. My voice came out steady. I don't entirely know how. I had 4 minutes. I know because I counted not deliberately. But the way you count things when your mind needs something to hold on to. I heard the key in the lock, walked down the hall, and by the time Tyler pushed the front door open and called out that it wasn't as bad as they'd thought, I was already in the living room, already sitting in my chair, already holding my cup of chamomile like I'd been there all evening. The tea was still warm. That detail mattered more than I can explain. If it had gone cold, I'd have had to explain why I hadn't touched it. If it had been freshly hot, he might have noticed I'd just made it. But warm was neutral. Warm was a woman who had been sitting quietly in her own living room, doing nothing in particular, on an unremarkable Thursday evening. You didn't have to wait up, Tyler said, setting his keys on the hook by the door. the same hook Walter used to use. Tyler had started using it somewhere around week 2, and I had not said anything. I wasn't waiting, I said, just reading. I gestured to the book on the side table. It was the same novel I'd had there for 2 weeks, open to the same page. Tyler glanced at it the way people glance at things they aren't really looking at, and I watched him do it. "Hungry?" he asked. "I could make something simple." "That would be nice," I said. I followed him into the kitchen. This was the part I had not anticipated, that the hardest thing would not be the search, or the photograph, or the sound of his key in the lock. The hardest thing was standing at the kitchen counter, watching Tyler, whoever he was, move through my home with the ease of a man who had already decided it was his, and having to arrange my face into something that looked like ordinary. He made eggs. Scrambled, with sharp cheddar, the way I'd mentioned once that Walter used to make them. He remembered things like that: food preferences, scheduling habits, small likes and dislikes. I had thought for a while that it was attentiveness, the mark of a good caregiver. Now I understood it differently. "You seem quiet tonight," he said, sliding a plate across the counter toward me. "Long day," I said. "The doctor called this morning." He looked up. "Everything okay?" "Just routine follow-up," I said. "You know how they are, always something to check on." He nodded, easy and slow, and went back to his own plate. We ate in the kitchen the way we sometimes did when neither of us felt like the formality of the dining room. I watched the way he cut his eggs into quarters before eating them. I had never noticed that before. I filed it away without knowing why. "Actually," he said after a few minutes, "I've been meaning to bring something up." He set down his fork, deliberate, the gesture of a man choosing his moment. "I was thinking, and tell me if this is overstepping, but with the hearing coming up, it might be worth having your paperwork in order. Your will, specifically." He tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was being careful to seem casual. Sometimes these legal processes go smoother when everything's clearly documented. Up to date. I have some experience navigating that kind of thing, if you'd want a second set of eyes. I let a small silence sit between us. Not too long. Just enough to seem like I was considering it. "That's thoughtful of you," I said. "I just want things to be easy for you," he said. "No complications." "Of course." I picked up my fork again. Though I think my will is fairly straightforward. Walter and I did all of that years ago. It's been, what would you say, settled. "Things change though," Tyler said. "Circumstances shift. It's worth revisiting." Maybe so. I reached for my water glass. I suppose I'd want my attorney involved for anything like that. Out of habit more than anything. Something moved across his face, small, quick, gone before I could name it. "Naturally," he said. We finished dinner without much more conversation. Tyler rinsed the dishes. I dried them the way we'd fallen into a habit of doing, standing side by side at the sink in a pantomime of domestic ease. He told me about his cousin, the car, the fender, the inconvenience of insurance calls, and I made the right sounds at the right intervals. I asked if his cousin was shaken up. He said she'd be fine. I said that was a relief. All of it true, none of it real. After, he said goodnight and went down the hall. I heard his door close. I heard the small sounds of someone settling in for the night water running briefly, a drawer, the soft click of a lamp. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer than necessary. There was a ceramic dish on the counter that had been Walter's mother's pale blue, hand-painted, the kind of thing that survives every household reorganization because no one has the heart to move it. I stood with my hand resting next to it and looked at the window above the sink, which only showed me my own reflection at this hour. I thought about the folder, the notarized pages, the photograph of Sophie with a red X drawn across her face like she'd been removed from a list. I thought about what Tyler had just said. Sometimes things go smoother when everything's clearly documented. I thought about the word settled and how I'd used it and whether he'd understood the second meaning of it, the one I'd intended. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked to my bedroom. Tomorrow, I would need to think very carefully about what came next. But tonight I had sat across the table from a man who wanted to take everything I owned, eaten scrambled eggs, and smiled at the right moments. And when he had asked me about my will, I had looked him in the eye and said, with complete and genuine calm, "I think everything is exactly where it needs to be." I meant it more than he knew. I left the house at 5 minutes to 7. Tyler's door was still closed. I could hear nothing from behind it, no movement, no alarm, just the particular silence of someone still asleep. I took my purse, my keys, and the folder I'd copied by hand onto 3 sheets of notepaper after midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and the kind of focus that only comes when you have no other option. I did not take the original. I left everything exactly where I'd found it. Then I walked next door. Ruth, whoever answered on the second knock, which told me she'd already been up. She was wearing reading glasses, pushed up on her head, and a cardigan over her nightgown, holding a mug that steamed in the cool morning air. She took one look at me standing on her porch and stepped back without saying a word. That was Ruth. We had been neighbors for 11 years. She'd moved in the spring after her husband passed different circumstances than mine, a long illness rather than sudden, and we had developed the kind of friendship that doesn't require much maintenance. Coffee sometimes, a wave from the driveway. She'd brought a casserole when Walter died and hadn't overstayed, which I'd appreciated more than I could say at the time. What I did not know, until this morning, was that before she retired, Ruth had spent 22 years as a licensed private investigator in Charleston. She had mentioned it once, years ago, in the way people mention former lives briefly, without emphasis, as though it belonged to someone else. I had not forgotten it. She poured me coffee without asking. I sat at her kitchen table smaller than mine, tidier, no evidence of anyone but her, and I told her everything. All of it. The drawer that moved, the overheard phone call, Dr. Ellison's careful voice, the folder in Tyler's desk, the will with my signature that I had not signed, the schedule of my routines cataloged in 2-week increments, the list of my assets rendered in careful, impersonal descriptions, and Sophie's photograph. I told her about the red X, and Ruth set down her mug. She didn't speak for a moment, just looked at the table between us, something shifting behind her eyes. Then she said, "I need to tell you something." Her voice had changed, still steady, but weighted in a new way, the way a voice gets when it's carrying something it's been putting down and picking up for a while. "Stephanie called me," she said. "The first time was maybe 5 months ago. She introduced herself, said she was your daughter, said she was worried about you, asking how you seemed, whether you'd mentioned anything about finances, whether you'd had any. She used the word episodes." Ruth looked up. "I thought she was concerned. I thought she was being a good daughter checking in on her mother from a distance." I stayed very still. "She called 4 more times," Ruth said. "I told her you seemed sharp as ever, that you managed everything yourself, that said you were doing better than most people half your age." A pause. "But she asked questions, and I answered them, because I thought I was helping." Her jaw tightened. "I told her your schedule. When you go to PT, when you do your grocery run. I mentioned the house once that you'd talked about whether to refinance the equity." The kitchen was very quiet. "Ruth," I said. "I didn't know," she said, not defensively, but with the flat precision of someone stating a fact they wish weren't true. "I didn't know what she was building with it. I thought I was being a good neighbor." She took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. I was being used. I watched her sit with that for a moment. There is a kind of pain that doesn't look like grief and doesn't look like anger. It looks like a person going very still while they recalibrate something fundamental about how they understand themselves. I recognized it because I had felt it standing in Tyler's room the night before, staring at my own signature on a document I'd never signed. Ruth was feeling it now. "I'm not angry with you," I said, and I meant it, the same way I'd meant things the night before at the dinner table with a precision that left no room for doubt. She looked at me. "I'm telling you," I said, "because you deserve to know that I'm not, and because I need someone who understands what we're dealing with." Something in her face resettled. She put her glasses back on. She pulled her cardigan straight. She picked up her mug, took a deliberate sip, and set it down again with the quiet authority of someone who has just made a decision. "Tell me what you need," she said. So I did. I told her about the notary seal on the will, the embossed stamp, the date, the placement. I told her about Tyler's references, the background check Stephanie had supposedly run before he arrived. I told her about the cousin, the convenient fender bender, the evening he'd come home early. Ruth listened without interrupting. She had a small notepad, the spiral-bound kind, nothing fancy, and she wrote 2 things down. Just 2. I didn't ask what they were. When I finished, she closed the notepad and stood up. "I still have some contacts," she said. It wasn't a boast. It was the same tone she'd used to say she still had a good recipe for cornbread. She walked me to the door. The morning had warmed slightly. I could smell someone's grass freshly cut a few houses down, the ordinary smell of an ordinary neighborhood going about its ordinary business. "Go home," Ruth said. "Be normal. Make breakfast if he's up. Don't change anything." "I know," I said. "I mean it, Margaret." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Don't tip it." "I won't." She nodded once. Her hand was already on the door. "Give me until noon," she said. She knocked at 11:53. I know because I had been watching the clock in a way I don't usually watch clocks, not anxiously, exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who has been told to wait and is doing their best to do it properly. Tyler had eaten breakfast, made a phone call from his room that lasted 12 minutes, and left for what he called errands at 10:15. I had smiled and said to take his time. The house was quiet again. I had spent the morning doing normal things. I watered the plants on the back porch. I sorted the mail. I washed the coffee mugs by hand and set them on the drying rack the way I always did, one handle facing out, the way Walter had taught me because he said it was easier to grab. At 11:53, Ruth knocked. I opened the door before she finished. She was carrying a manila folder thinner than the one I'd found in Tyler's desk, but held with a different kind of weight. Her expression was the one I imagined she'd worn in her professional years, not cold, but sealed. Whatever she was feeling, she had put it somewhere it wouldn't interfere. She came inside without being asked. She set the folder on the kitchen table and sat down. I sat across from her. "His name isn't Tyler," she said. "It hasn't been Tyler for a long time." She opened the folder. The first page was a printout, a public records document, the kind her contacts could pull without much difficulty if you knew where to look. At the top, a name, Nathan Cole. Below it, a date of birth that made him 38. Below that, an address history that moved across 3 states in 6 years. And below that, a record, elder financial abuse, the charge filed in Sarasota County, Florida 4 years ago. The case had been adjudicated. Ruth used that word carefully, meaning it had gone through the system, but the outcome was a civil settlement rather than a conviction. He had paid a portion of what was taken. He had not served time. He had moved on. "He does the same thing each time," Ruth said. She wasn't reading from notes. She had committed it. "Gets placed as a caregiver, builds trust, handles paperwork. When the documentation is in place, he moves the assets." She paused. "He's careful about the line between civil and criminal, stays just on the manageable side of it." "How many times," I asked, "that I can confirm?" 3. She turned to the second page. "The most recent one before you was a woman named Eleanor Voss, 78 years old, Columbia, South Carolina." I looked at the page. Eleanor Voss had owned a house on a half-acre lot, a savings account she and her late husband had built over 40 years, and a small collection of jewelry her mother had left her. She had a daughter in Charlotte who visited twice a year, and a neighbor who brought her groceries on Tuesdays. 6 months after Nathan Cole arrived as her caregiver, she had nothing. The house transferred. The accounts drained by degrees small withdrawals that stayed below the thresholds that trigger automatic review, spread across enough time to look like ordinary spending. The jewelry gone without documentation. By the time her daughter in Charlotte realized what had happened, the legal paperwork was in order and Eleanor had signed everything. She now lived in a care facility outside Columbia. She had not returned home. Ruth let me sit with that for a moment. "Stephanie," I said. "Yes." The word landed with a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. Not surprise I had understood since last night that Stephanie was involved. But understanding something and hearing it confirmed by a woman who spent 22 years following evidence are different experiences. "She knew," I said. Not a question. She knew. Ruth's voice was even. His placement agencies are a front paper thin, but functional enough that a background check comes back clean unless you dig past the first layer. Stephanie didn't run a surface check. She requested a full file. Ruth tapped the folder, which means she knew what that file contained. I thought about my daughter calling Ruth 5 months ago. The careful questions, the building of a record, the word episodes, dropped into an otherwise normal conversation like a seed. I thought about the birthday dinner 2 years ago when Stephanie had seemed not distant exactly, but measuring, like someone taking stock. How did Stephanie find someone like him? I asked. The question was genuine. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer, but I needed it the way you sometimes need a thing you aren't ready for because not knowing is worse than the weight of knowing. Ruth didn't answer with words. She reached into the folder, removed one more page, and placed it on the table between us. Then she folded her hands and waited. It was a bank statement. Not mine. The account number and header were different. The name on the top line partially obscured where Ruth had covered it with a strip of white tape, careful and deliberate. But the transaction entries were visible. 2 columns of numbers, dates running down the left side. I leaned forward. The amounts were not small. They were not the careful, threshold-avoiding increments I'd just read about in Eleanor Voss's file. These were larger, irregular in size, but regular in direction. All outgoing, all within the last 14 months. I started reading from the top. I got through 4 lines before I understood the shape of what I was looking at. I had not finished reading when Ruth's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, then at me. I looked up from the statement. There was more on this page than I had gotten to yet. I read to the bottom of the page. Then I read it again. Ruth sat across the table and let me do it without comment, which was exactly right. Some things need to be absorbed in silence, without the interference of someone else's reaction shaping your own. The account on the statement wasn't Stephanie's. Ruth had been careful about that, the white tape still covering the name at the top. But the pattern was unmistakable once you understood what you were looking at. 14 months of outgoing transfers, irregular in amount but consistent in direction. The kind of financial bleeding that starts small enough to explain away and accelerates once the habit is established. And at the bottom of the column, a note Ruth had added in pencil, small and precise. Recipient account N. Cole, LLC Shell, registered Delaware. I set the paper down. I had expected anger. I had been running on a version of it since the night before, cold, functional anger, the kind that keeps your hands steady when you need them steady. I had expected that reading the full shape of it would sharpen that anger into something clean and decisive. Instead, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She owes him, I said. $180,000, Ruth said. Accumulated over 14 months from a private investment vehicle he structured. She put money in expecting returns. The returns were real for the first 4 months, just enough to establish trust. Then they weren't. I understood the mechanism. I had been a nurse long enough to recognize the structure of something designed to look like help. And the arrangement? I said. Ruth nodded. Best I can reconstruct, he offered to clear the debt, or at least suspend it, in exchange for access. Access to me. Access to this house. To you. To your paperwork, your routines, your trust. She paused. He needed someone on the inside, someone who could provide context, make his presence here seem natural. I thought about Stephanie's phone call 3 months ago, when she'd first mentioned a caregiver. The way she'd framed it, "I've been worried, Mom. I just want to make sure you have support." The careful language. The concern that had sounded like concern. I had been touched by it. She didn't design this, I said. Ruth looked at me. She didn't build it, I said. She got into something she couldn't get out of, and he gave her a door, and she walked through it. I looked at the statement. That's not the same thing as designing it. No, Ruth said. It's not, but she made choices. She did. I sat with that. The kitchen was doing its ordinary afternoon things, light moving across the floor, the refrigerator cycling, a mockingbird somewhere outside running through its repertoire of borrowed songs. The world was behaving normally, the way it always does when the thing happening in front of you is anything but. My daughter had known what Nathan Cole was. She had known what he had done to Eleanor Voss in Columbia, a woman she'd never met, a woman who now lived in a care facility because the shape of what happened to her in her own home had made it impossible to go back. Stephanie had known all of that, and she had given him my address and my schedule and the hours when I went to physical therapy and the name of the grocery store I preferred. She had also, I was certain, sat in her own apartment at some point in the last 6 months and felt something she could not name, some precursor to the phone call I suspected was coming. Because Stephanie was not cruel. She had never been cruel. She was frightened and in debt, and she had made a terrible decision, and then another, and then another, the way people do when they are trying to survive something they are ashamed to admit. I knew my daughter. She's still my daughter, I said. Ruth didn't flinch. She held my gaze with the steadiness of someone who had made peace with difficult truths long before this kitchen table. She's still letting it happen, she said. The words were not unkind. They were simply accurate, the way Ruth tended to be accurate without decoration, without the softening that would have made them easier to hear but less true. I didn't argue. I didn't agree either. I just sat with both things at once, the daughter who had brought Tyler here and the daughter who had called me every birthday without fail for 46 years. The daughter who had let a man photograph my granddaughter and draw a red X across her face, and the daughter who had taught Sophie to say please and thank you before she was 2 years old. People are rarely one thing. I had known that for a long time. I had just never had to apply it quite this personally before. Ruth was gathering the papers back into her folder when my phone rang. The sound was ordinary enough, the same tone it always made, the same small vibration against the table. But we both looked at it at the same moment, with the same quality of attention. The name on the screen was Stephanie. I looked at Ruth. She gave me nothing, no instruction, no warning, just the neutral expression of someone who understood that this part was mine to navigate. I picked up the phone. Mom. Stephanie's voice was not casual. It was not the rehearsed brightness she sometimes used when she was managing me from a distance. It was tight, compressed, the voice of someone trying very hard to sound normal and not quite succeeding. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. A half-second pause. Then, "Are you home right now?" "I am," I said. "Just having lunch." Another pause. Shorter. Something in the background on her end, a door, maybe, or a window being opened or closed. "Is Tyler there?" she asked. "He went out for errands this morning," I said. "I'm not sure when he'll be back." The silence that followed lasted just long enough to tell me something without telling me anything specific. Whatever had prompted this call, it was not a social visit. Stephanie's voice, when she spoke again, was quieter and very careful. "Don't sign anything today, Mom," she said. "Okay? If he asks you to sign something, just don't." Then she hung up. She called back 11 minutes later. I know, because Ruth and I had not moved. We were still at the kitchen table, the bank statement folded back into its folder, the folder closed. Neither of us had suggested leaving. Neither of us had suggested staying. We had simply remained where we were, the way you do when you understand that the next thing is coming and there's no point walking away from it. When my phone lit up, Ruth looked at it first, then at me. I picked it up. "Mom." Stephanie's voice was different this time. The careful brightness she sometimes used, the tone she'd deployed for years when she wanted to seem lighter than she felt, was gone. What was left underneath was something rawer and less managed. "I need to talk to you about the paperwork." "All right," I said. "Tyler mentioned that there are some documents that need to be updated before the hearing. Just clarifications," he said. "Language in the current will that could cause confusion with the court." A pause. "He thinks it would be better to get it settled this week." I let a small silence sit between her words and mine. "What kind of documents?" I asked. "Just estate stuff. Standard." The word standard came out slightly too fast, the way words do when someone has rehearsed them and the rehearsal is showing through. He said, "It's nothing you haven't already agreed to in principle." I had agreed to nothing. We both knew that. "Stephanie," I said quietly. She stopped. "Talk to me." Another pause, longer this time, and shaped differently. Not the pause of someone choosing a careful word. The pause of someone standing at the edge of something they've been standing at the edge of for a long time, looking down. "I'm just relaying what he said," she told me. "I know," I said, "but that's not why you called." The silence that came next was the kind that has texture to it. I could hear her breathing slightly uneven, the way breathing gets when a person is working to keep it steady. I could hear something in the background, faint, that might have been traffic or a television in another room. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I had sat with people in the particular moments when they were about to say a true thing they'd been holding for a long time. You learn to recognize the sound of it, the quality of the air just before. This was that sound. "He said, I need to make sure you sign before Friday," Stephanie said. Her voice had dropped not to a whisper, but to the register of someone making themselves smaller. "He's very specific about the timeline." "I'm sure he is," I said. "Mom?" "Stephanie." I kept my voice even. Not cold, I didn't want cold. I wanted something that could hold weight without breaking. "I need to ask you something." "Okay. When you called earlier, you told me not to sign anything, and now you're calling back to tell me to sign something." I paused. "Which one is you?" 10 seconds of silence. I counted not with anxiety, but with the steady patience of someone who had decided to wait as long as it took. She didn't answer the question directly. What she said was, "Things are complicated right now." "I imagine they are," I said. There are, he has, she stopped. Started again with a different entry point, the way you try a different door when the first one won't open. I made some decisions over the past year that I can't undo quickly. And there are people involved who have more leverage than I would like. And a breath. I need this to go smoothly. For everyone. I looked at Ruth across the table. Ruth was watching me with the same sealed expression she'd worn all morning, but her hands had gone still around her coffee mug in the way hands go still when you're listening to something that matters. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand its shape, even from one side. I thought about Eleanor Voss. I thought about a woman in Colombia who had believed someone was helping her and had signed the documents that ended her life as she'd known it, because she'd trusted the wrong person and no one had called her beforehand to say don't. I thought about Sophie's photograph with the red X across her face. And I thought about my daughter, not the version of her in Ruth's folder, not the version attached to 14 months of outgoing transfers, but the one who had sat in the back seat of our Buick at age 7 and asked me whether birds got lonely when their flock flew without them. The one who had called every birthday for 46 years without missing once. The one who was on the phone right now, her voice 2 sizes smaller than it should be, trying to manage a situation that had gotten so far past managing that she couldn't find the edge of it. Stephanie, I said, come see me tomorrow. A beat. Just you, I said. No, Tyler. The silence that followed lasted 10 full seconds. I know because I counted those too. Mom, she said finally. Her voice had changed again, something stripped away, something underneath it that was almost relief and almost terror at the same time. Just come, I said. He'll know. 3 words. Quiet. Not a refusal. She hadn't said I can't or that won't work or any of the careful deflections I might have expected from someone who'd rehearsed their position. She had said he'll know, which was a different thing entirely. It was the statement of someone who had been living inside a situation that had eyes, someone who understood that her movements were being tracked, her conversations anticipated, her options narrowed in ways she hadn't fully consented to. It was the first time she had said it plainly. Not I don't want to, or it's complicated, or let me think about it. He'll know. 3 words that confirmed everything Ruth and I had been sitting with all morning. Tyler, Nathan, whoever he was, had not simply placed himself in my house. He had placed himself around my daughter as well. Around her debt and her fear and her choices and whatever remained of her ability to choose differently. She wasn't calling to push me toward the paperwork. She was calling because she didn't know what else to do. I know he'll know, I said. Come anyway. Another silence, shorter this time. Then, very quietly, so quietly I almost missed it. Okay. She hung up before I could say anything else. I set the phone down on the table. Ruth picked up her coffee mug, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. She's coming, I said. Ruth nodded once. Outside, the mockingbird had started up again, the same restless, borrowed song, running through every voice it had collected and making something new out of all of them. She was 20 minutes early. I had expected 2 o'clock. When the knock came at 1:40, I was still on the back porch with the watering pitcher. I set it down and walked to the front door. Stephanie was standing on the step with no sunglasses, no jacket, none of the careful, put-together quality she'd maintained every visit for the last several years. Her eyes were red in the specific way that comes not from a single cry but from days of accumulated pressure. She was not wearing makeup. That, more than anything, told me she had not prepared for this. Come in, I said. I brought her to the living room, not the kitchen, which carried too much of the last week in it. The living room was older territory, the couch where she'd done homework in high school, the bookshelf Walter had built from scratch one summer because the store-bought ones weren't deep enough. She sat. I sat across from her. I didn't know how bad it had gotten until it was already bad, she said. I waited. The investment was real at first. He had a track record, or what looked like one. Documented returns, other investors, everything that makes something legitimate look legitimate. She pressed her fingers together in her lap. Kevin doesn't know. I used money from my personal account, the one from before we married. I thought I was being smart. When did it change? Month 5. No hesitation, she'd been over the number enough times to have it memorized. The returns stopped. He said temporary adjustment. Month 6. I asked for a partial withdrawal. Lockup period, he said. Standard practice. Month 7. I asked again. Processing delay. She looked at her hands. Then he started talking about other options, ways to offset the loss. One of them involved you. She looked up. He said you had assets that were essentially unmanaged, that helping you simplify your estate would benefit everyone. If I could facilitate an introduction, she stopped. He made it sound like I'd be helping you and solving my problem at the same time. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. There's a difference. There is, I said. Once Tyler was here, the request became more specific. Documents he needed confirmed, details about your routine, whether you had a regular attorney. She exhaled. And by then I'd said yes to enough things that saying no felt like standing in the middle of a room and realizing the walls had been moving the whole time. The room was quiet. "Stephanie," I said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at me. "I know about the will." I watched her face move through something I couldn't fully name. "I found the folder in Tyler's room 8 nights ago," I said. "There's a document notarized, dated 6 weeks back with my signature on it, leaving everything to you, removing Sophie entirely." Stephanie went very still. "And I know about the photograph of Sophie," I said, "the one with the red mark across her face." She stared at me. And then her face did something I had not expected. It collapsed. Not the collapse of someone caught. The collapse of someone who has just been told something they didn't know. "What photograph?" she said. Not a question. The flat, airless statement of someone whose mind is working very fast and coming up empty. Printed on regular paper. From Easter, the yellow dress. A red X across her face. Stephanie's hand came up to her mouth. She sat like that for a long moment. "I didn't know about the will," she said, voice muffled. "I knew he was preparing documents. I knew there was a plan for the hearing, but he never showed me a will." She lowered her hand. "He never told me about Sophie." I looked at her carefully. 31 years as a nurse teaches you to read the difference between a person performing surprise and a person experiencing it. Performed surprise is a beat too wide, a fraction too theatrical. What I was looking at was neither of those things. My daughter had not known. Tyler Nathan had been running a version of this plan that Stephanie was only partly inside. He had used her access, her knowledge of my routines, her debt and her fear as instruments, and he had kept the sharpest parts of it from her, because a person who knows too much becomes a liability. She had handed him the door, but she hadn't known what was behind it. "He's going to destroy us both," Stephanie said, quietly, without drama. "The way you state something you've understood for a while but haven't been able to say aloud." I looked at my daughter, red-eyed, unguarded, sitting on the same couch where she'd done her homework 30 years ago, and felt the last of the distance I'd been maintaining give way to something older and more stubborn than strategy. "No," I said. She looked at me. "We're going to stop him." Carol Simmons did not offer coffee. That was the first thing I noticed. Every waiting room I'd ever sat in doctors' offices, insurance agencies, the estate lawyer Walter and I had used years ago had offered coffee. Carol's office had a credenza along the wall with a coffee maker on it, but nobody mentioned it, and somehow that felt right. This was not the kind of meeting that needed softening. She was already at the table when we were shown in. 58, I guess trim, precise, silver hair cut short without apology. She had the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from long practice at containing motion. A yellow legal pad sat in front of her, pen uncapped, 2 lines already written in small, tight script. She had been expecting us. "Sit down," she said. Not unkindly, just directly. We sat Margaret, Ruth on my left, Stephanie on my right. I had spent the drive here watching Stephanie in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge the condition of her. She had slept, I thought, though not well. She was holding herself with the particular rigidity of someone who has made a decision and is afraid that if they loosen their posture, the decision might loosen with it. Carol looked at each of us in turn. Then she set her pen down and folded her hands. "Tell me everything," she said. "In order. Don't editorialize, just sequence." So I did. I started with Tyler arriving at my door 7 weeks ago. I told her about the drawer that had moved, the overheard phone call, the word timeline. I told her about Dr. Ellison's careful voice on the phone, the cognitive assessment Stephanie had requested, the hearing scheduled for 7 days from now. I told her about the folder in Tyler's desk, the will with my signature, the schedule of my routines, the asset list, the photograph of Sophie. Ruth set the folder on the table as I described it. The bank statement, Nathan Cole's public record, the connection to Eleanor Voss. Stephanie told her portion quietly, the investment, the 5 months of returns, the lockup period, the escalating requests. Her voice stayed steady. I watched Carol's pen move across the legal pad in short bursts, capturing things without interrupting. When we finished, Carol was quiet for a moment. She picked up the will, the copy Ruth had made from my handwritten notes, not the original, which was still in Tyler's drawer exactly where I'd found it, and read through it with the focused attention of someone who has read documents like this before and knows precisely what to look for. Then she set it down. "All right," she said. "Let me tell you what you have." She ticked the points off without consulting her notes. A forged testamentary document with a fraudulent signature, notarized and dated. A documented pattern of elder financial abuse across multiple victims in multiple states. A caregiver operating under a false identity with prior civil adjudication in Florida. A coerced secondary party. She glanced at Stephanie without judgment, who can provide first-hand account of the arrangement and its terms. And a guardianship petition filed by the same party orchestrating the financial scheme. Time to the document preparation. She set her pen down. "This isn't opportunistic," she said. "This is organized." He identifies a target, installs himself, documents a competency narrative, files the petition, and executes the transfer under legal cover. The guardianship isn't incidental, it's the mechanism. Once he controls your legal decision-making, every signature becomes uncontestable. The room was quiet. I had understood the pieces individually. Hearing them assembled in Carol's precise, unhurried language was different. It was the difference between knowing a storm is coming and watching someone show you the pressure map. "What do we do?" Ruth asked. Carol picked up her pen again. "3 things. In parallel," she said. "First, the original will stays in that drawer. Do not touch it, do not move it, do not let him know it's been found. Chain of custody matters. If we retrieve it improperly, it complicates what we do with it." I nodded. "Second, Stephanie's account of the arrangement needs to be documented formally. Signed statement, dated, witnessed. Today, if possible." She looked at Stephanie. "That becomes the backbone of the counterfiling." Stephanie nodded. Her jaw was set. "Third, we file a preemptive motion challenging the competency petition on procedural grounds. It won't stop the hearing, but it forces the court to scrutinize the petitioner's standing. Buys us time and puts his record in front of a judge before he gets to present his version." She looked at each of us in turn. "We don't just defend," she said. "We go on offense." I felt something in my chest shift, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes when you have been carrying something alone and someone capable sets their hands on the other side of it. Carol was already writing when her desk phone rang. She held up one finger without looking up, finished her note, then picked up the receiver. The call lasted 40 seconds. She said 3 words, when, where, and certain, and hung up. She looked at us. Something in her expression had changed, not alarmed, but recalibrated. The way a face changes when information arrives that requires immediate adjustment. "The notary who stamped that will," she said. "I had my paralegal run the license number this morning." A pause. "He's affiliated with 2 other fraud filings in the past 18 months. Both elder financial abuse cases, both in South Carolina." She set her pen down carefully. "He booked a flight this morning," she said, "departing tomorrow at 6 a.m. Tyler made pancakes on Wednesday morning. He set them on the table with the same easy competence he brought to everything plate-centered. Syrup on the side because he'd noticed I preferred it that way, a small glass of orange juice I hadn't asked for but always wanted. He poured his own coffee, sat across from me, and asked if I'd slept well. Well enough, I said. I ate my pancakes. I told him the ones last week had been better slightly, and he laughed and said he'd overdone the vanilla this time. We talked about whether it would rain before Friday. He mentioned a book he'd been reading. I asked what it was about. This was my life now. The performance had become so practiced that it no longer felt like performance. It felt like a second skin I'd grown over the past several weeks, thin enough that I could still feel everything underneath it, thick enough that nothing showed through. Underneath it, everything was moving. Carol had called the evening before not to my cell, which Tyler could potentially monitor, but to Ruth's landline, which Ruth then relayed by walking over at 7 in the morning with the information folded into ordinary conversation. Carol had received Tyler's supplemental filing, 2 additional affidavits from what appeared to be medical contacts, attesting to observed confusion and financial mismanagement. Both were dated within the last 3 weeks. Both referenced incidents I had no memory of because they had not happened. She was already preparing the response. Stephanie had submitted her formal statement the previous afternoon, signed, witnessed, dated. Carol said she'd read it twice and called it the clearest account of coerced financial facilitation she'd seen in 11 years of elder law practice. Stephanie had driven home afterward and, according to a brief text Ruth showed me, sat in her car in her own driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Ruth had handled the notary. I didn't ask for details, and Ruth didn't offer them. What she told me was that the notary, a man named Gerald Pratt, license number on file with the state bar, had been intercepted before his 6 a.m. flight and had, after a conversation Ruth described only as productive, agreed to provide a voluntary statement to Carol's office, confirming that the will's execution had not followed standard notarial procedure. His signature had been obtained under representations that were, in his own words, not entirely accurate. That was enough. I drove to Columbia on Thursday. Eleanor Voss lived at a care facility called Magnolia House, 40 minutes south of the city center. Ruth had called ahead a contact of a contact, the quiet network of a woman who had spent decades learning which doors opened if you knocked the right way. I was expected. The facility was clean and well lit, and smelled of something floral that wasn't quite flowers. A young woman walked me to a sunroom at the end of the east wing, where Eleanor was sitting in a wheelchair near the window with an Afghan across her lap and a paperback open face down on the table beside her. She was smaller than I'd imagined from Ruth's description. Fine-boned, white-haired, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to move through the world using minimal energy. But her eyes, when she looked up at me, were completely clear. "You're Margaret," she said. "I am. Sit down." I sat. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me about Nathan Cole, the way you tell a story you've been over so many times it has worn smooth, no jagged edges, just the shape of it. The caregiver who knew her routines. The paperwork that arrived in small increments. The day she'd signed something she didn't fully understand because she was tired, and he was patient, and she had trusted him the way you trust someone who has been kind to you for months. She told me about the morning she'd understood what had happened. The phone call from her bank, the document her daughter had found, the attorney who had reviewed it and told her, with genuine regret, that everything was in order. She told me about moving into Magnolia House. "He's very good at waiting," she said. "He doesn't rush. That's what makes him dangerous. Most people who want to take something from you are impatient. He isn't." "I know," I said. I had been living with his patience for 7 weeks. Eleanor looked at me for a moment. Then she reached across the space between us and put her hand over mine. Her hand was very light, the way hands get when the years have taken the weight from them, but the pressure was deliberate. "Don't let him win," she said. I looked at this woman in her wheelchair in her sunroom, with her borrowed Afghan and her face-down paperback and the window showing a courtyard she could see but no longer walk in. "I won't," I said. I meant it the way I had meant very few things in my life all the way down, without remainder. I drove back to Charleston in the late afternoon, the folder Eleanor's daughter had prepared sitting on the passenger seat. Additional documentation, photographs of the original property, correspondence from the period of Nathan's employment, a copy of the civil filing that had gone nowhere. Carol had asked for anything Eleanor could provide. Eleanor had provided everything. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Tyler's car was gone. An errand. Probably he had mentioned something about a pharmacy. I had nodded and said, "Take your time," and meant neither part of it. I went inside. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet the night I'd found the folder entirely mine, for however long it lasted. I stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked to the bedroom. The closet door was slightly open, the way it always was since the hinge had settled. I had been meaning to fix it for 2 years. Walter had put it on his list and never gotten to it, and after he died I had kept meaning to and kept not doing it, because fixing it felt like erasing something I wasn't ready to erase. I reached in for a cardigan. My hand found something else. It was hanging at the back of the closet, behind my thing's dark navy wool, slightly heavier than I'd remembered, the kind of coat that was made to last and had. Walter had given it to me the winter after our wedding, when we didn't have much money and he'd saved for 3 months without telling me. I had not touched it since the week he died. I stood there with my hand on the sleeve, in the quiet of a house that was finally, after 7 weeks, fully mine again, and felt something move through me that wasn't grief exactly, and wasn't strength exactly, but was somewhere in the place where those two things meet. Tomorrow was 5 days before the hearing. Tonight, I just stood there with my hand on his coat. I put on the coat at 7:15. It still fit, that was the first thing I noticed. The shoulders sat exactly where they were supposed to. The wool still heavy in the way. Good wool stays heavy. The navy still dark enough to mean something. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway and looked at myself for a moment. Walter had picked this coat because he said navy was the color of people who had already made up their minds. I picked up my bag and walked out the front door. The courthouse was a 20-minute drive. Ruth had offered to come. I'd told her I had what I needed. Stephanie was meeting us there. Carol had said to arrive by 8:45. The docket had us at 9. I arrived at 8:38. Carol was already in the hallway outside the courtroom, standing with her paralegal and a banker's box that I knew contained, among other things, the original will retrieved from Tyler's desk 3 days ago under careful chain of custody conditions, Gerald Pratt's notarial statement, Nathan Cole's Florida civil record, Ruth's compiled documentation on Eleanor Voss, and Stephanie's signed account 12 pages, witnessed, dated, every detail of 14 months rendered in the flat, precise language of someone who has decided that accuracy matters more than self-protection. Carol looked at the coat. "Good," she said. Just that. Stephanie arrived 4 minutes later. She was pale but steady, wearing a dark blazer I hadn't seen before, her hair pulled back. She looked at me across the hallway, and something passed between us that didn't need words. The particular understanding of two people who have sat in a living room together and said the true things, and are now standing on the other side of having said them. She walked past Tyler's side of the hallway without looking at him. He was already there, Tyler or Nathan, or whatever name he was using in the moment, standing near the far end of the corridor with a man I took to be his attorney. He was dressed well. He held himself with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to go the way it had always gone. He had a leather portfolio under one arm. He glanced at me when I came in. I looked back at him steadily and then looked away, which is not the same as looking down. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional quiet of a room where difficult things are decided without ceremony. The judge was already on the bench when we filed in. A woman in her early 60s, reading glasses low on her nose, reviewing something on her desk with the focused expression of someone who does not consider her time negotiable. Tyler's attorney went first. He presented the cognitive assessment, Dr. Ellison's original, which Stephanie had requested, supplemented by the 2 affidavits Carol had identified in the supplemental filing. He spoke fluently about patterns of financial confusion, about isolated incidents suggesting diminished capacity, about the petitioner's genuine concern for the respondent's welfare. He used the word well-being 4 times. He was polished and unhurried, and I watched the judge's pen move in small, careful strokes as he spoke. Then Carol stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform indignation or lean into the drama of what she was about to do. She simply opened the banker's box. She started with the will. She walked the judge through the document, the notary seal, the signature, the date. She presented Gerald Pratt's statement, in which he confirmed that the execution had not followed standard notarial procedure and that the representations made to him at the time of signing had been materially inaccurate. She presented the analysis from a forensic document examiner, 2 pages, clinical confirming that the signature on the will did not match Margaret Ann Calloway's authenticated signature samples across multiple verified documents. Tyler's attorney objected twice. The judge sustained neither. Then Carol presented Nathan Cole's Florida record, the civil adjudication, the settlement, the victim profile. She presented Ruth's compiled documentation on Eleanor Voss photographs, correspondence, the civil filing that had gone nowhere. She presented a pattern. Same approach, same timeline, same documents, different names. She said, "This is not a concerned family member seeking to protect a vulnerable elder. This is a coordinated scheme executed by a man who has done this before, under a false identity, using forged legal instruments." The courtroom was very quiet. Stephanie was called as a witness. She walked to the stand with the same steadiness she'd had in the hallway, not the steadiness of someone who isn't afraid, but the steadiness of someone who has decided that being afraid is no longer the point. She answered Carol's questions in the same clear, unhurried voice she'd used when she gave her written statement. She described the investment, the debt, the arrangement, the escalating requests, the things she had done and the things she had not known. She did not look at Tyler once. When Tyler's attorney cross-examined her, she answered each question the same way she'd answered Carol's directly, without elaboration, without flinching. He tried 3 angles. None of them found a gap. Then Carol called me. I walked to the stand in Walter's coat and I answered every question put to me. I described finding the folder. I described the will, the asset list, the photograph of Sophie. I described 7 weeks of careful observation, the drawer, the phone calls, the word timeline, the conversation at the dinner table about estate documents. I described Dr. Ellison's call and what I had understood from it. The judge asked me 2 questions directly, whether I had at any point requested a cognitive evaluation and whether I had at any point instructed anyone to prepare or update my will. No, I said. To both. She wrote something down. Carol made her closing argument in 4 minutes. She asked the court to dismiss the petition, to refer the matter to the appropriate authorities, and to note for the record the identity discrepancy between the petitioner of filing and the individual present in the courtroom. The judge set down her pen. She looked at the man sitting across the aisle at the leather portfolio, the good suit, the easy confidence that had not, I noticed, been entirely easy for the last 40 minutes. "Mr. Cole," she said. "A pause." Or should I say Mr. Nathan Cole? The courtroom went very still. Tyler stood up and stopped. We sat in Ruth's car for 5 minutes without saying anything. Not because there was nothing to say. There was, I imagined, quite a lot about the morning, about the judge's voice, about the particular sound a courtroom makes when the air goes out of it all at once. But neither of us reached for any of it. We just sat in the parking garage with the engine off and the light coming through the concrete slats and long pale bars, and let the quiet be what it was. Ruth had her hands in her lap. I had mine folded over my bag. After a while she said, "You doing all right?" "I think so," I said. "Ask me again in an hour." She nodded, which was the right response. We had gotten the news in pieces, the way these things tend to go, not in one clean announcement, but in a series of smaller confirmations, each one adding weight to the one before it. Carol had found us in the hallway afterward, banker's box tucked under one arm, and told us the petition had been dismissed with prejudice, which meant it could not be refiled. Tyler Nathan had been detained by 2 men Margaret didn't recognize, but Carol clearly did, who had been waiting near the side entrance with the patient, unhurried quality of people who had arranged to be there in advance. Carol had used the phrase referred to the appropriate authorities the way a surgeon uses technical language precisely, without drama, because the situation didn't require any. Ruth had squeezed my arm once, briefly. That had been enough. Now, in the car, I thought about Eleanor Voss in her sunroom at Magnolia House, with her borrowed Afghan and her face-down paperback. I thought about what she'd said, "Don't let him win," and the weight of her hand over mine, light as paper, deliberate as a signature. I thought about Walter's coat. "Ready?" Ruth asked. "Yes," I said. Stephanie had texted while we were still in the courthouse. "Kevin is bringing Sophie. Can we meet somewhere that isn't official looking?" I had suggested the small Italian place on King Street where Walter and I used to go for anniversaries. Stephanie had said perfect in a way that felt like more than a restaurant preference. They were already there when we arrived. Sophie was sitting in the booth with the children's menu she was using as a hat, balancing it on her head with the focused concentration of a 9-year-old who has discovered a new use for a laminated object. Kevin was across from her, watching with the expression of a man who has recently been given information that reorganized his understanding of the past year and is still in the process of reorganizing it. He stood when we came in. We shook hands. There was no script for this particular moment, so we didn't try to follow one. Sophie looked up from her menu hat. She had Stephanie's eyes and Walter's chin and a gap between her front teeth that I'd been watching fill in slowly since she was 6. She looked at me across the restaurant the way children look at adults when they're deciding whether the occasion is serious, and then she got up from the booth and crossed the room and put her arms around my waist with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had decided it wasn't. I put my arms around her and stood there for a moment, with my granddaughter's face pressed against Walter's coat, and felt something in me that had been held very tightly for a very long time release its grip by one small degree. "Hi, Grandma," she said into the wool. "Hi, baby," I said. We ate lunch. It was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when you've been through something that isn't, and the ordinariness is itself a kind of gift. Sophie told me about a book she was reading. Kevin asked about the history of the restaurant. Ruth, who had joined us, told a story about a case from her working years that was funny in retrospect and had not been at the time. Stephanie was quiet through most of it, present, but quiet, listening more than speaking, watching Sophie with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself years ago when Stephanie was small and I was learning what it meant to be responsible for something that mattered more than anything. When Sophie and Kevin went to look at the dessert case near the counter, Stephanie turned to me. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I'm not asking for that." She looked at her hands, then back up. "I just want the chance to be different." I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked across the restaurant at Sophie, who was pointing at something in the dessert case with the absolute conviction of a child who has identified exactly what she wants and sees no reason why the universe shouldn't agree. Sophie, who had been in a folder in a man's desk drawer with a red mark across her face. Sophie, who was right now standing on her tiptoes to see over the counter, gap-toothed and entirely unaware, the same as she had always been. I looked back at Stephanie. "I know," I said. "It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness is a longer road than an afternoon, and I have never believed in shortcuts on roads that matter. But it was something. It was a door left open rather than pulled shut, which is where most things that matter have to start." Stephanie nodded once. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and looked away, and that was that. On the drive home, alone in my own car, I reached into the pocket of the navy coat to find my keys. My fingers closed around something else first. A small square of paper, folded twice. I could feel the creases under my fingertips, sharp and deliberate, the way paper folds when someone has taken care with it. The pocket had been empty this morning when I put the coat on. I had checked, the way I always check pockets. I pulled it out. The handwriting on the outside, just my name, Margaret, in full, was Walter's. I would know it anywhere, in any light, on any surface. 44 years of grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter had made his handwriting as familiar to me as my own. I sat in the parking lot outside our house, with the engine running and the afternoon light going gold across the windshield. The paper was folded shut. I hadn't opened it yet. I didn't open it that evening. I kept the folded paper on Walter's side of the nightstand, the side that had been empty for 3 years, and let it sit. I knew his handwriting the way I knew, the sound of his car in the driveway. 44 years builds that kind of knowing into your bones. I just wasn't ready. Then one morning in July, I was. 3 months had passed since the hearing. Nathan Cole had been formally charged in 2 jurisdictions. The Florida civil case had been reopened. Carol called it what it was: organized, deliberate, and not the first time, and said there were investigators who had been watching him for longer than we had and were glad for what we'd given them. Eleanor Voss received a partial settlement. Not the house, but enough. Her daughter called me in May to say thank you. I said she deserved it and meant it completely. Stephanie was paying back what she owed, not to Tyler, whose financial claims had been absorbed into the criminal proceedings, but in the broader sense. She found a therapist she described, in the careful, understated way she inherited from Walter, as useful. She called on Sundays. The calls were sometimes short, sometimes long, occasionally awkward in the way honest things are when you're still learning their shape. But they were real in a way our conversations hadn't been in years. Kevin knew everything. That had been its own storm, and not mine to weather. But they were still there on the other side of it. Sophie came on Saturdays. She had claimed the chair to my left on the back porch, the smaller one that had belonged to no one in particular. She brought her book and I brought mine, and we sat in a quiet that required nothing except presence. Sometimes she asked about Walter. I answered. 9-year-olds ask better questions about the dead than most adults do because they haven't learned yet to be afraid of the asking. It was a Saturday in July, early enough that Sophie wasn't there yet, when I finally picked up the paper. The garden was doing what Walter's gardens always did in summer, slightly overgrown, enthusiastically alive. The roses going where they wanted with no regard for the structure he'd originally planned. I had stopped apologizing for it. I was sitting in my chair with my coffee, Walter's chair beside me, empty. I reached into my cardigan pocket. The paper had softened from 3 months of handling, moved from nightstand to pocket to purse and back again, the way you carry something you aren't ready to put down or open. My name on the outside, in his handwriting, had not changed. I unfolded it. Walter's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of an engineer who believed legibility was a form of respect. One line, no greeting, no date, no signature, because he would have known none of those were necessary. The people who love you don't just say it. They make sure you'll be all right. I read it once. Then I sat with it. I thought about the coat hanging at the back of the closet for 3 years, waiting. I thought about a man who had understood in whatever private moment he'd made this calculation that there might come a time when I needed something from him he could no longer give in person, and had found a way to give it anyway. That was Walter. Not dramatic, not showy, just quietly, thoroughly prepared the way he fixed things before they broke, stocked the pantry before the storm, built the bookshelves deeper than the store-bought ones, because he knew what we had was worth keeping properly. They make sure you'll be all right. He had made sure. He had left me a house with paid equity and organized files. He had left me the instincts of a nurse and the stubbornness of a woman who had come through one hard season and knew she could come through another. He had left me Ruth's number in the address book, under R, where I could always find it. He had left me the coat. I folded the paper back along its original creases and held it in both hands. The garden moved in the morning air. Down the street, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire, a cardinal, a jay, something I didn't recognize, something new. Walter's chair was beside me, empty and not empty. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Margaret had people who showed up when it mattered. Ruth at the door at 7 in the morning. Carol, who opened the banker's box without drama. Stephanie, who finally told the truth when it was hardest. And Walter, who had made sure long before any of it happened that she would be all right. My question for you, when the people in your life say they love you, do they say it or do they show it? And has that difference ever mattered to you in a moment that counted? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If you're watching from somewhere I've never been, drop your city or your country below. I'm always glad to know where these stories travel. And if this one meant something to you, subscribe so the next story finds you the same way this one did. Take care of yourself. And if someone in your life is making sure you'll be all right, let them.